Why have the Utah Jazz come up empty while big game hunting? And is big game hunting a viable option for the Utah Jazz? Next on Locked on Jazz.
You are Locked on Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
How are you? I'm David Locke, radio voice of the Utah Jazz, Jazz NBA insider, and this is Locked on Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. When you come here, we're talking Jazz. We promise you know what you're going to get. On today's show, there have been 4, maybe 6 players that would classify as big game hunter that have moved in the last few years, and the Jazz have gotten none of them, and there might be one other available. At one point, there are 2 other available right now that no one's going to get. So why have the Jazz struck out on big game hunting so far? And is big game hunting actually a viable answer for the Jazz in the future? And then this all, of course, plays into Lauri Markkanen and the conversations around that. I was in Vegas yesterday and saw the Taylor Hendricks explosion. He was fabulous. We'll talk about that game, some changing opinions I have the more I watch our guys and all that's taking place. So we'll have that for you as well. As I mentioned, this is Locked on Jazz. It's your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz, giving you insight, expertise, geeky numbers, and hopefully making it way better to be a Jazz fan each and every day. Thank you so much for making Locked on Jazz your first listen of the day. We are free and available on all podcasting apps, as well as on YouTube. So thank you. Please subscribe, follow. Likes are appreciated. Thumbs ups and comment, send us notes. You can also now comment on Spotify as well when you're listening on the app. And to the everydayers, you are the best. Thanks so much for tuning in. All right, great time in Vegas. Truly, I had a blast. You guys don't really care about that, but it's just kind of cool. It reminded me I've been in the league for 30 plus years, a lot of friends, really good time, enjoyed it. Got to spend some time with Danny yesterday after the Jazz game, watching the next game, which is always super interesting in his points of view on things and learning a lot. So that was great. All right. So this is not related, by the way. Danny and I did not talk about the following topic, just to be clear. It kind of suddenly sounded like we did. So the Jazz are kind of in this role of we trade our 2 best players, 3, 4, 5 best players, and got a bunch of draft picks and assets so that we could pounce when the time came, and Danny referred to it as big game hunting, and it's really exciting. It's a great way to say it, so we're going to keep that. And since the Jazz have been in that circumstance, there have been 5 big game hunting players that have moved. They are Damian Lillard, Paul George, Kristaps Porziņģis, Jrue Holiday, and Mikal Bridges. And in the midst of that, I would say the Jazz were intimately involved in 4 of the 5. So let's look at those and figure out what has happened on those and whether or not the Jazz can play big game hunting. And why did the Jazz go 0 for 4 or 0 for 5 on those? The thing that's interesting to me about big game hunting is the real question of whether it's really a viable option for the Jazz. And I think that's part 2 of this conversation. But let's walk through those 5 for a second, because I think what we'll find at the end of these 5 is there is one player in recent times that would be classified as big game hunting that has switched teams. And that, I think, is what we're going to see as the model for what the Jazz have to do. So let's start with Lillard. He went first of this group. And I think in Lillard, and here's one thing I think is interesting. Of the 5 players that have moved in this time period, none of them are a top 20 player in the NBA. None of them. So, we're kind of going medium game hunting. No top 10 player, no top 20 player in the NBA in the time we've done this has changed teams. So Lillard currently ranks 27th in the Ringer top 100. Paul George ranks 23rd. Kristaps Porziņģis ranks 42nd. Jrue Holiday ranks 38th. And then Mikal Bridges ranks 50th. So on Lillard, the fact was, I just don't think it matched our timeline. We were involved, we talked, we matched our time. In retrospect, had the Jazz wanted to go get Damian Lillard, they could have. Like, that's the one here where, honestly, if you look back at it, Damian Lillard's trade to the Milwaukee Bucks and what Portland ends up getting for that deal is DeAndre Ayton, Toumani Camara, Jrue Holiday, a 2029 first-round pick, and 2 pick swaps from the Bucks. I don't know what our equivalent to DeAndre Ayton would have been on October 12th of 2023, that's when that story was updated. It was traded before that. Oh, it's a September trade, if I remember correctly. September 27th, I think, is the answer. What we could have met, but we probably could have done that deal. Okay? Like, if we really want to get down to it, it was a 3-team deal, it had a bunch of pieces. We probably could have gotten Damian Lillard. But, honestly, I wasn't a proponent of it. He's got a huge contract. I don't think we were ready to win at that point. And he is 34 years old now at this point. That's truly not matching a timeline. Like, if you're going to go get Damian Lillard, you shouldn't have traded Donovan Mitchell and Rudy there. So, but if you're like, okay, so for the old big game hunting star, the cost was 2 starters, one of which you're now moving for another player in Jrue Holiday, and a first-round pick and 2 pick swaps. That's not outrageous. That would be encouraging of what could take place. The next move was Kristaps Porziņģis, 42nd best player in the league. And this one's really interesting because what the Jazz had done is put themselves in position to get Kristaps Porziņģis in free agency. They were going to use cap space to sign Kristaps Porziņģis. And 6 days before free agency started, Kristaps Porziņģis picks up his option and allows Boston to trade him, or Washington to trade him to Boston. And it's a steal. This one's another one where you're like, okay, the price is not bad. In fact, Boston got a 2025 first-round pick in the deal and a 2024 first-round pick in the deal. They traded Marcus Smart, and they took Kristaps Porziņģis' contract, and somehow Boston ended up with the picks in this deal and with Kristaps Porziņģis, which ended up giving them the key piece, one of the key pieces to their title, ironically enough, along with the next player we're going to talk about in big game hunting. So again, this would say big game hunting is viable because the only thing that took place here is that another trade came in before you could go get the guy in free agency. He seemed like he was willing, and frankly, it was not expensive. It was not expensive. Now let's go to the next 2. Because the next 2 and the last one begins to put some real concern to me of whether or not big game hunting is totally viable. So we were in on Jrue Holiday, according to all reports. And Jrue Holiday went to Boston in exchange for 2 players and 2 first-round picks. Like, to some extent, I do think this is a trade that we could have matched and marked at some point here. Now, whether Jrue Holiday wanted to come to Utah and whether he, is a question that we'll never know on the backside of this one. But in the Jazz could have, if they had the Jazz had the equivalent of a Malcolm Brogdon. They probably had the equivalent of a Robert Williams, and the 2024 first-round pick from the Warriors. It's not a great pick, and the 2029 unprotected pick from the Celtics. We'll see. So, Portland ends up doing 2 deals here with Lillard and Holiday and doesn't get a great deal out of either of them. And so the Jazz maybe should have the Jazz in retrospect, if they really believe Jrue Holiday was that, gone and put out a 3rd first-round pick. Well, this leads us into the problem with this deal and the next deal, which makes big game hunting super hard from the spot where the Jazz have themselves posted, hiding in the bushes with their little trade rifle, trying to make deals. And I'll explain that next on Locked On Jazz. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Game Time does a wonderful job to give you everything you need when you're looking for tickets on the open market right now. Here's why Game Time is so great. Well, first of all, Game Time is the place to pick out specific games you want to see, matchups you want to watch, and have Game Time help you out in the sports world. They have customized your spot. You can get the app to list you certain spots so they know what your preferences are. They have last-minute deals, flash deals, zone deals, all to help you find easy ways to buy tickets to a local game. And you go on the road, you're going to go see an MLB game, you're going to go see a WNBA game. Views for all seats in the venue are available. I love that feature, particularly when I'm going to look at concert tickets or game tickets to make sure that I am not suddenly in a position where I'm going to be obstructed or just a little bit further away or a funny angle. Plus, you got lowest price guaranteed, event cancellation protection, and job loss protection. It's all at Game Time. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets. If you're heading to a ball game, you're going to go see a matchup, go do it with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem your code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. That's LOCKEDONNBA. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jazz your first listen of the day. We are free and available on all podcasting apps, as well as on YouTube. And when you tune in, you know exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get Utah Jazz conversation each and every time. You're not flipping on the radio station and wondering what you might get. You know exactly what you're getting each and every time. For your second listen today, Locked On NBA will be available for you all season long, 30 minutes every day, giving you the latest updates on everything that's taking place. So make sure you check that out on that. And Big 6 and 60 is our new show. I really like it. It's the 6 biggest stories in the NBA from our local hosts, or 6 biggest stories. We are probably going to launch, maybe, a Big 3 and 30 for sports specific. So we're thinking about that. Tell me if you think that's a good idea. Tomorrow's show, by the way, will be an Ask LOJ edition. So if you have anything you want to send me, please do. All right. Let's get to the worrisome thing. So the Jazz have done a wonderful job of coddling together picks. So as of right now, we're sitting here with this like bushel. We have 3 first-round picks next year, one of which is our own. The next 2026, we have 1, so that's 4. Then we have 4 picks in 2027, so that gets us to 8. Then we have our own in 2028, that's to 9. Then we have 3 in 21. That gets us to 12. And then we have 1 each. So we have 12 picks through 2029. And here's where I think things get a little tricky for us. If you're the Boston Celtics, and they didn't really have to do this on Jrue Holiday, but the Knicks did on Mikal Bridges. And I think the expectation for Portland was that they were going to be able to flip Malcolm Brogdon for another first-round pick, and that didn't turn out to be as easy as they thought. But if you're the Jazz and you're sitting with your set of picks, you have to decide on the Jrue Holiday deal. Do we throw a third one in? You know, okay, we've got 12 left. We're going to need to use some of them to acquire our own players. We're going to need 5 somewhere to go get a really great player. We're going to need another 3 to get a player. We're out. Like, unless we think that Jrue Holiday is our second best player, which when he's ranked 38th in the league, probably doesn't get it done. You need somebody better. And so you suddenly look at your collection of picks, and while it sounds like we have a ton, which we do, you kind of have to know, okay, well, if we're going to get somebody who's a top 20 player, and there just have not been many that have moved, that's the next question we have to discuss, is if we're going to top 20 player, we're going to need 5 of these probably to be moved on that player. If we're looking for like a top 30 player, it's going to cost us 3 or 4 of them. So that's 7. We probably want to have some left to use for ourselves as we develop particularly our own right now until we figure out how good we're going to be. And suddenly it's funny, you're running out of inventory awfully quickly. And so when you suddenly look at Jrue Holiday, the Jazz, it feels like the Jazz could have gotten Jrue Holiday with a 3rd pick. Maybe they would have taken a 4th pick because we didn't have a Malcolm Brogdon that they thought they could flip for another player. And they end up getting, I think, Denny Advada with Malcolm Brogdon. So are you willing to give up the third and fourth pick for Jrue Holiday when you look into your grouping and say, well, yeah, but then when we have a chance for really big game hunting coming up here, then all of a sudden we're short a pick? That would be disastrous. This is even more pronounced on the Mikal Bridges trade. Because the Jazz were supposedly in on the Mikal Bridges trade. And when you look at what the Knicks gave up for Mikal Bridges, which is an unprotected 2025, an unprotected 2027, an unprotected 2029, an unprotected 2031, a top 4 protected 2025, and a pick swap. 5 first-round picks for the player ranked 50th in the NBA. This is my biggest fear. There's 2 fears I have about whether big game hunting is actually a viable option for the Utah Jazz. And this is number 1. That when the Jazz sit there and are talking about getting the 50th best player in the NBA. So if you're looking at trying to build a championship team, Mikal Bridges is your third piece. Like, you have to go get a top 10 player, a top 20, hope Lauri becomes a top 20, and you go get Mikal Bridges, and he's your third piece. And it's going to cost, and the Knicks roll out 5 first-round picks and a pick swap for him. The reason this is problematic is because if, as we just talked about, if the Jazz, you have this huge set of inventory we talked about, the 3 picks in 2029, the 4 picks in 2027, the picks in your own picks in 28 and 26 that are pick swap available. If you trade your pick, by the way, you can't pick swap. Right? Like, if we trade our pick in 2026 and 2028, we suddenly can't pick swap. Can't pick swap without a pick. So you probably are a little reluctant to trade, particularly 2028 with Cleveland. You just don't know where they're going to be at that point. There's a reluctance to trade certain things all the time. Pick swaps next year, I think we'd be willing to move 2025. It's protected. You have to move the protection, and then someone will have to be all right with that. And it's pick swappable. Cleveland and Minnesota are both going to be better than us, so we're not going to pick swap in 2025, barring something crazy. Oh, actually, we just have their picks. 2026 doesn't feel like we're going to be better than them yet in 2026. Okay. You get the point. So here's what gets really, really difficult. Is the Knicks don't give a darn. Because Mikal Bridges is their final piece. They don't have any more cap space. They don't have any more room. They can't add another player. They're not looking for another. They have Julius Randle. They have Jalen Brunson. They have the Villanova group. They have the whole thing. And so when it gets down to, like, let's say the Jazz are willing to put 3 first-round picks on the board for Mikal Bridges, which seems like a lot for the 50th best player in the NBA, and New York is like, we'll put out 5 because we don't care. Because this is our final piece. We're making a run at it. We're going to be good for a while. And the cost isn't that much to us in the sense that the 2025 pick shouldn't be that good, nor should the 2027. So we're really making a risk about 2029 and 2031. And maybe a slight risk in 2025. But the Jazz, in that circumstance, have to be a little smarter because, again, you have this cadre of picks, but you don't want to suddenly give up the 5th first-round pick for Mikal Bridges when you suddenly need that 5th pick to go get somebody who's in the top 30 or top 20 in the NBA. And that's where this big game hunting is tough when you're trying to build an entire roster. Right? Like, we have Lauri Markkanen, and after that, as of right now, it's not clear who our second best player is, and I don't know if anyone snuck into the bottom of the Ringer's top 100 players. Like, I think, that's maybe, if you ask people have different opinions on who's our second best player. Some people think it's Walker. Other people think it's Colin. Maybe it's going to be Keontae. Maybe it's going to be Cody Williams. But as of right now, we're trying to build a whole roster this way, and you have to be really careful about what you're willing to give up in your inventory to be able to do that. So this then leads to Collins 96th on Ringer's Honey. This leads to two other questions. Is big game hunting actually viable for the Utah Jazz? And how does it impact Lauri Markkanen? We'll do that next as we continue on Locked on Jazz. So the question to me on whether big game hunting is actually viable gets to this. There have been 5 players that have been moved in this time period: Lillard, Porziņģis, Holiday, Bridges, and Paul George. We weren't in on Paul George. The only player in the top 20 of the players ranked by the Ringer in the NBA that has been traded is Tyrese Haliburton. And that might be the real answer here, is that you've got to find a way to find who the next Tyrese Haliburton is going to be. Because when you traded for Tyrese Haliburton as the Indiana Pacers, Tyrese Haliburton was not a top 20 player. And I don't think people thought he was going to be the Olympic team point guard and be a top 20 player. He's 18. The next one that might be available, he's kind of known, is De'Aaron Fox. And then is there a player out there that you've noted that could become available who you believe could be that player? Certainly Jalen Williams at 40 is going to be that player, and Chet Holmgren at 43 seems to be. But is there somebody else out there that's on an upward trajectory where you can go make some sort of move, Domantas Sabonis for Tyrese Haliburton, and make that? And that's where Lauri gets really, really interesting. Like, if you believe that Jonathan Kuminga, Moses Moody, Devin Vassell, Brendan Podziemski, or one of these players out there, or a Jalen Johnson in Atlanta, I'm just throwing out a wild card, or an Anthony Simons in Portland, is untapped and about to explode and become a top 20 player in the NBA in a new circumstance with new responsibilities and new options, and you trade Domantas Sabonis / Lauri Markkanen, very similar players, then that makes sense. Because then that's creating the big game after you get them. You know, if you think Cade Cunningham or Jaden Ivey or someone like that's it's got the chance to explode, and you make a Lauri Markkanen deal where you trade your version of Domantas Sabonis to go get that player, that might be the answer, because the one top 20 player in the NBA that has been moved in the recent years was not a top 20 player when he was moved. And I think that's super important. The other thing that I do think is really interesting about this, and where I think there's some questions of whether you can really go big game hunting, are twofold. One, I've addressed the first one, which is when you're trying to build an entire roster out of big game hunting, it's hard to manage your inventory. Whereas if you're just one of these teams that's really pretty good and you're trying to add one piece onto the puzzle, then you just throw the last piece of the kit and caboodle in, and who cares? But what's also, so that's my first concern, which leads me to, if you want the conclusion on that maybe you have to go find, build your roster, go down, go get low in the draft, go get one or two pieces that are really certain pieces, so that you have, what we're learning is that you have 2 or 3 pieces and you're adding your fourth. You're adding your Jrue Holiday. You're adding your Mikal Bridges. You're adding your Kristaps Porziņģis. That's where going to get the trade for the top 50 player works, is when you already have Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, when you already have Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle. Jalen Brunson actually has changed teams too. That was a little earlier than this. That's probably another name that should be thrown in there. Just a great free agent signing by the Knicks. But that might be the answer. So the two things I would say about this in regards to Lauri is, if you have a player you think is going to evolve into the top 20 and you can make that move, then that's big game hunting. Number 2 is, maybe you can't really big game hunt until you've got enough pieces built in, which was kind of Danny's point from the beginning, which is, I don't want to be in a position where when we finally have the guy who can go big game hunt, that we're going to end up needing still another 3 or 4 more years. Which now leads to the next point, which is kind of what do we actually have with Keontae, Cody, Taylor, Bryce. I'm forgetting somebody. Isaiah Collier. Like, what do we really have? Do we have any pieces in there that are going to be top 50, top 30, top 20, top 10? And then that dictates probably a little bit what you do next. The final thing I would say that I think is most interesting about this is if we define big game hunting as top 50 players in the NBA, there are 2 that are available right now and nobody wants them. Right? Brandon Ingram seemingly is very available right now, and so is Trae Young. And for whatever reason, nobody wants to touch the 35th and 36th best players in the NBA, which would be 2 of the better players that have been moved in the last few years. So it's a really interesting thing because then it's not just you're trying to get a top 50 player in the NBA, you're trying to get the right top 50 player in the NBA. And then that market gets really small, and that's why someone like the Knicks seemingly throws in a 5th first-round pick for the 50th best player in the NBA, and for them it was probably the right move, but for the market, it's a crazy move. All right, last night, Taylor Hendricks was great, so we can relieve all concerns. Maybe not. But that was kind of my point on yesterday's show, is that with the games that Cody Williams and Taylor Hendricks have right now, they're not going to be able to dictate the night. The night has to dictate it for them. And Taylor Hendricks was certainly aggressive, but Toronto also wasn't really playing. I think Brandon Carlson started at center for them, and Ochai Agbaji started at power forward. And so they had, Ochai doesn't rebound, and so they had almost no rebounding on the floor. And so in that matchup, Taylor Hendricks took advantage, was super aggressive on the offensive glass, got a few buckets, hit 3 of his 4 threes, so he had a good shooting night, got out and ran on a few things and went crazy 9 for 10. Great night. But I think Taylor is at a point where, 1, he plays with better players, and 2, he has to, he dictate his game, the game dictates his night more than he's able to dictate his night, if that makes sense. That was my point yesterday. I'm kind of holding to it. I will tell you, the more I watched in Vegas, the more my opinions varied from player to player. Super high on Isaiah Collier when the week started, and as the week went on, like, I really, really like him, but he only has one route to play. He can only be a point guard. Okay? Like, he is not a good enough shooter or big enough to be a shooting guard. So he has to be the player with the ball in his hands, making decisions, and he has to be good enough at that to play. That's hard. That's a hard route, singular route to the playing court. It's like, this isn't a great example, but Udoka Azubuike only had one route to play. He had to be a center, and he even more specifically had to be a drop big center, and he had to be playing on a team that didn't want to play stretch, right? Like that was Filipowski was better yesterday. He's had some really tough moments. He is super skilled. And if he can shoot it, he's a stretch 5, and stretch 5s are valuable. Now, it's interesting. They're having him defend the 4 while Hendricks defends the 5. But getting a stretch 5 is a unique skill set. General feeling from talking to everyone around Summer League was like pretty stunned that he was available at 32 with that skill set. He moves his feet far better defensively than I think he gets credit for. And I don't think can play drop, but I do think can play some sort of switching defense where if he's playing the 4 or the 5, it doesn't matter. You don't want to do it for a long period of time. Eventually, I think he gets put on an island. But I actually think he can probably play a switching defense. And then he's really, really skilled offensively. And so kind of, like just to contrast those two, both drafted similarly, there's actually a lot of different ways Filipowski gets on the floor. He can play probably a little 4. He can play a little 5. He plays stretch in all circumstances. He can switch defensively. I guess I don't think he can probably play in the drop, but you could probably try for a little bit. You could zone up with him. There's some things that can be done there. And so that I think leads you to like, okay, actually he might have more routes to play on the floor. Collier has one route to get on the floor, which I think makes it hard for him. So I think that's interesting. My favorite player in Summer League is Darius Bazley. I don't know if he's going to make the roster, but everything he does on the floor in a Summer League game, he can go do in an NBA game. Darius Bazley is my most favorite player I've watched in Summer League because it's adaptable to the NBA. And I think that's it. I think that's, kind of interesting. The other last one I would just leave you with, Taylor's body is just way better than it was a year ago. I just think that's really as important as anything else. Our staff has done a great job. The Jazz strength and conditioning staff has done a great job with him. It just, his body looks so much different and stronger. He's going to have to learn how to be better balanced. That's the thing I talked about the other day. It'll help him both laterally and overall. But his body is really different. A bunch of those tip-ins last night against smaller guys, he was getting bumped and he was able to handle it in a way that I don't think he would have yesterday. He was really great yesterday. But I'm not, again, as I said yesterday on the show before, he was great. Like, Taylor doesn't dictate. The game dictates whether Taylor's great or not. Taylor's game isn't able to just stamp himself onto a game. Some of the scouts I was seeing with dude both really like Taylor and Cody. But that's NBA bodies. Like, those are NBA bodies with a multitude of ways to get on the floor. That's kind of the point. All right, that is Locked On Jazz today. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you are to the everydayers, I greatly appreciate you. If you're on video, we'll send you the Locked On Sports Today, first ever national 24/7 channel. If you're on audio, check out the Big 6 for 60. Ask LOJ tomorrow. Send me your questions. Have a great one.